For the CIA, diversity is absolutely instrumental to what we do. I mean, we are meeting with people from every part of the globe. We need to have linguistic diversity, cultural diversity of thought. If we want to develop rapport with people and convince them to commit treason against their own country, for the sake of our national security, we need to be able to understand the way they think and their viewpoint and connect with them and find out what's important to them. We cannot go back to a time, which we were, an organization that was male, pale, and Yale. That just does not serve anyone.
Hello, and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Frank Price. I'm the chair of the International Relations Member-Led Forum at the Commonwealth Club World Affairs, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. Now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speakers and authors for whom I have deep respect. Christina Hillsberg, the author of Agents of Change, is a former CIA intelligence officer and writer. While at the CIA, she wrote analytic assessments for the president, his cabinet, and other senior-level policymakers. Hillsberg specialized in African politics and leaders and was one of the intelligence community's few Swahili and Zulu linguists. She later worked at the CIA's Directorate of Operations, clandestinely collecting intelligence from the field. Terry Shames is an award-winning, best-selling author of 11 Samuel Craddock mysteries, as well as winning the Macavity Award for the best first novel. Her first book, A Killing at Cotton Hill, was also shortlisted for the Strand Critics Award. She has been shortlisted for the Left Coast Crime Lefty Award, and in 2016 won the RWA Editor's Choice Award for The Necessary Murder of Nani Blake. After graduating from the University of Texas, Shames worked for the CIA for 3 years in the China division. After she left the CIA, she went into computer programming and analysis for 10 years, during which she began writing fiction. You have both worked at the CIA, and you have both become important authors, and you have at different times shared different and divergent experiences. It's now the time to explore your observations and writing. So, Christina, tell us about the book and what inspired you to write Agents of Change.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. Agents of Change is narrative nonfiction. It's a look at the role of women at the CIA from 1960 to present day, and it's told against the backdrop of the larger women's movement. And so what I mean by that is I organized it by decade, and so each chapter introduces you to what was going on with women politically, socially, culturally during that time period before delving into what was going on at the CIA and specific women's stories who are emblematic of that particular era. And so we talk about, popular perceptions of the female spy throughout the decades, like the Bond girl, and things that, we would recognize, but then juxtapose that to what life was like in real espionage.
Wow. I did read the book, and I love the analogy there. Terry, your first job at the CIA was in Washington, D.C., mapping coordinates for an unknown country. But that was short-lived. You were offered a chance to go to Nigeria or to a South American country. Why didn't you?
I was so young, and it was in the 60s, and I did not know what I was getting myself into with those countries. And I was, to be frank, I was scared. I didn't know what it would be like. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. So they said, well, we'll put you in the China division. And I said, I don't know Chinese. But it turned out to be really interesting because it was during the Cultural Revolution. And I learned a lot about China. They told us a lot about China, but China was closed to people during that time. So that's what happened next.
Okay. Did you feel like you were qualified for the job, Terry, or underqualified, overqualified?
I wasn't. I didn't ever think in terms of that. I was always a go-getter. So whatever they gave me to do, I would do. But what happened is at some point I realized that there was no intelligence coming into China or going out of China. and I was at Langley, and they one day the boss had our whole division had this big talk, and he said, well, we're going to be changing the way things are done, and anybody who knows me knows I never am quiet about my thoughts, and I said, sounds to me like they're going to shut down this division. He called me into his office afterwards, and he said, you shouldn't have said that. And I said, why not? I think it was true. He said, I'm going to give you the opportunity to go wherever you want to go. You can choose anything. I said, I'd like to go into computer programming. He said, oddly enough, we are having a 6-month course that you can take. So they taught me everything that was known at that time about computer programming, and that's how I got into computers. They sent me to school and paid me to learn about computer programming in the 60s, a brand new thing. So, it was a great opportunity. Yeah.
That's so fascinating, because I think that's such a great example of how some parts of the agency were leaps and bounds ahead of other parts.
Yes.
So when I was researching, I spoke with women across the agency directorates, and they did say that, when you're looking at analysis and then more technical and computer programming, with regards to opportunities for women, those other directorates did really well, even in some of those early years.
You're absolutely
So
right.
that was really encouraging. The women that I dove into were in the director of operations, which, as you know,
That's totally different.
they had a different experience in
Well, I
terms of
read your book,
opportunities.
and so I.
Well, and you know firsthand.
So I know. I was reading that, and I said, "Wow, this my experience was very different."
So different.
Yeah. Because I had the men that I was involved with in the CIA were very encouraging for women, because it was a brand new field. Computer fields it's a brand new field, and they were welcoming to women.
Yeah,
totally.
that's great.
Yeah.
Wow. So who's better at espionage, James Bond or women CIA officers?
As much as we all love James Bond, and we do, okay, and I want to make that clear. In our home, we are a James Bond family. We love the movies, okay? But he's a terrible spy. If you are, causing a scene in the middle of a city with a car chase or a shootout, you have done something terribly wrong, okay? So I would argue that any real CIA officer is a better spy, but women in particular make fantastic intelligence officers. And this is something that came up time and time again in my interviews, that women had examples of ways that we are exceptional at espionage operations. And some of them on the surface sound like generalizations, things like, oh, we're nurturing, we're better listeners, we're detail-oriented. Sure, those can be considered generalizations, but when you hear them time and time again, anecdotally, it's hard to ignore. And there were things that women said, we notice things that our male colleagues don't notice. Sometimes our assets are more comfortable sharing with us because they don't feel the pressure to one-up, their male handler. But also, more often than not, it's this idea that women are underestimated and we're overlooked. And so we can blend into the background. And so, for example, one of the women I talk about in the book is Marty Peterson. And she was the first woman to operate clandestinely in Moscow in the 70s. And the reason why she was able to conduct dead drops for the station's most prized asset, who went by the code name Trigon, was because it never dawned on the KGB that we would be using a woman. Right. So they just ignored her. And when she arrived in Moscow Station, even station management thought she must be missing her surveillance, right? She must just not see them because, she's a woman. We haven't really had a lot of them in the field. She probably just doesn't see it. So, of course, they sent a man to go sit, on her route to double check that she wasn't missing anything. And in fact, she wasn't. And so they were able to use that to their advantage. And so that's something that women, even, to today's time, we are often underestimated, particularly in different cultures around the world. And so we can blend into the background and steal secrets right under the noses of foreign governments without them, being any wiser. So, much better than James Bond, as much as we do love him.
So let me just reiterate something for Terry. In your new computer programming, did you feel that you were equal to the men in CIA, that you were treated in the same way, or were there any?
Absolutely. I felt like in this new tech world, they didn't care whether you were a man or a woman. We were in this program for 6 months, and at the end of the 6-month period, they decided to give us all projects. They divided up the class, and I was one of the people who was the head of one of the projects. And, you know, as a woman, you would think, well, you know, could women do this? But they thought I could do it. And I do not remember whether the other people were men or women, but I do know that I was invited to be one of the project managers because it seemed like it was a very equal kind of environment. And even after I started working, I think being outspoken didn't hurt me at all because men underestimated women who were mousy, and I was not mousy. And so I think every boss I had would just say, yeah, you know, maybe you should cool it a little bit, but go for it. You know, I mean, because I was a woman, it was okay, you know, and in that tech environment, it was I felt like I was absolutely celebrated. Yeah.
Very different than the experience.
And I'll mention this. After I left the CIA and got into the working world that was not the CIA, I did find that I was underestimated as a woman. It was much harder. For some reason, I think the military, the CIA, the FBI were all a little more forward-looking about that. Yeah.
Interesting. I have a question for you. You use the word sisterhood between the relationships between early female spies. Based on your experience at the CIA and your interviews with dozens of women across generations, do you think that's an adequate description?
You know, when we first submitted this book to publishers, it had the word sisters in the title. And as I began interviewing more and more women, I had to go back to my editor and I said, you know, this just doesn't feel like the right fit. And what I found was, so when you start, you look at kind of the 1960s, there were so few women in the Directorate of Operations. It was often like 4%, only a handful in a class at the farm, the agency's clandestine covert training facility. And so at that time, yeah, there wasn't really much of a sisterhood because there were so few of them. If they were lucky enough to get a division, you know, i.e. a male manager to sponsor them so that they could, you know, go through operational training and go to a field station, they were often the only woman in that field station, right? And at that time, you weren't instant messaging or emailing women from other stations. The only form of communication was a cable, and that went through the chief of station, right? So it started as isolating, and so there was this idea of scarcity. So one of the women I talk about in the book is Lucy Kirk, and she began in the 60s, and you know, she wrote a memoir of her time as well, and the title is We Already Have a Woman We Like. And it's because if they had one woman, that was all they needed. They checked the box, right? And so there was this idea that there wasn't enough, right? And so it created a little bit of this competition. As the decades went on, you saw pockets of women working together. You know, and I talk about some of the watershed moments in the book. For instance, in the early 90s, there was a landmark discrimination case and then a class action settlement. And those things were really important for the role of women. But there was this idea of women who had kind of made their way up, but forgot to send the elevator back down for the other women, right? And so it was this idea of, well, it was hard for us, it should be hard for you too. And some of the stories that were shared were, you know, sometimes some of the most, you know, unforgiving managers were other women. And so that was disheartening to hear. So I think it has changed. You know, in the late 80s, they did have the creation of the DO Women's Advisory Council, and that worked to ensure women and minority representation on promotion panels. So that was a really important step. And then those cases I mentioned in the 90s. So we have been seeing a shift. But I will say that the sisterhood I feel is after having left the organization. And I think that's been the most rewarding part of reporting and writing this book, was getting to know women who have spent time there, because after you're out, there is this bond, right? You have this immediate connection. Even like Lucy, who I mentioned, who started in the 60s, she and I have this shared experience that we have this immediate connection and friendship. And that has been so rewarding because it spans generations, it spans time, because we have that. So I would say it didn't exist for a long time. It's coming, slowly around. But I think once we leave in that pressure of making our way up to the top and getting our piece of the pie, it's lifted, and we're able to kind of see what we have in common.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes,
Okay,
of
so,
course.
this was something that I was interested in when I was reading the book, is what do you think were the traits that women had who managed to make it into the CIA in the 60s and the 70s, the early times? What made them able to do this?
Well, a lot of the women who joined at that time, despite being put into largely secretarial and logistic type roles, they were highly educated women. And women, one of the common threads I found was they were women who had interest in an international career, women who were interested in adventure. Several of them, myself included, had thought we would join the Peace Corps, and kind of incidentally fell into the CIA, right? And I mean, the amount of women that we all have the same story, it's very eerie. And so those were like some common traits. But then the women that you see who become successful over the years, a lot of times find themselves emulating more of the stereotypical male traits, because it was an old boys club. They're trying to kind of be seen as an equal. And so women, like, for example, a woman named Carmen Medina, who I talk a lot about in the book in terms of atmospherics. She's an author herself now as well. She has a fantastic book called Rebels at Work. She talked about how she feels that her personality is just naturally more in line with some of those stereotypical male traits, and so it helped her. But for some women, it could be more difficult. And so they either, kind of shifted to make themselves more like that to be successful, or they didn't, and there, were ramifications of that. But there's definitely a commonality of feeling like you need to be a certain way, one of the boys.
Be able to dance in heels backwards.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Terry, I have a question for you in the same light. Being a successful author and being well known, do you find that there's any kind of male-female competition or any kind of discrimination from male authors in regards to organizations and publishing?
Yes.
Can you
Ooh,
perhaps
tell us more.
enlighten us with some, maybe not examples by name, but of situations?
I'll tell you. I just yesterday was reading a list of things of books that someone had read. Everyone was supposed to talk about the books they'd been reading this year, and there was a man who is sort of in this organization. Every single book he listed was by a man. And I just thought, doesn't he read any women authors? Because we're half of the authors. Now, I must say that Sisters in Crime, which was formed about 35 years ago, really, really changed that a lot. It was the idea of this organization, which was formed by Sarah Paretsky, was to help women crime writers become more visible, because they've always been half of the crime writers, but for some reason, a lot of the awards and a lot of the accolades were all, reviews were all geared to men writers, and so I think some of that still exists, and there are women writers who are very, very determined to make that change. Ellen Byron comes to mind, who she writes books I don't read because they are cozies, they're cute, they're sweet, but a lot of people love them, and she's very successful, and yet there's this whole sense that that's not real writing, that's something else. It's like romance writing. It's like It's like, there's always this feeling that it really isn't a serious endeavor. And we work just as hard as everyone else, the women do. There are men authors who are very, very supportive of women writers. So, yeah, you still get that.
I think you are seeing more women spy thriller writers come
Yes.
to the fore,
Yes.
which has been fantastic. Like Karen Cleveland, for example, she's former CIA.
Yep.
Anna Petonia comes to mind, Flynn Barry. But by and large, I would say that genre has also been
Always meant, yeah. Always
whether
meant,
it's actually numbers dominated by men or if those are just the names you're hearing about. And similarly, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was for historical record, because I like to say you can't throw a rock without finding like a memoir by a man about his espionage war stories, but it's very uncommon to find women's stories.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we could talk all day long about the reasons why that is, but I met a lot of women who had never shared their stories. I mean, women into their 70s and 80s who had never rolled back their cover, who asked me to use a pseudonym because they're very active in their community and their closest friends still don't know that they were
Isn't that
undercover.
fascinating? I love
yes,
that.
and so it's so interesting. And so to be able to share some of those stories so that they're not lost, I mean, for the sake of historical records, so that we can really appreciate the accomplishments of these women who really are the reason why I was able to have the career that I had, right? And I mean, the message that I hope everyone will take away from this book is that women are a vital part of national security. And without them, our country is weaker. And I just think it's such an important time right now, in particular, to amplify women's voices and to ensure that their stories are being told.
Yep.
Just out of curiosity, with the recent DEI rollbacks for women and minorities, the CIA, what do you think that's going to leave us with?
It's when I finished this
question.
book, I had no idea at the time, and how could I, that so much of the progress that I celebrate in these pages in just a few months would be reverted seemingly in an instant in January. And so some of that has been particularly hard to swallow. So for example, one of the groups that I had mentioned that came about in the late 80s, the DO, Directorate of Operations Women's Advisory Council, groups like that are gone. You go to the agency's website and look up diversity, and it will give you an error message and say the page no longer exists. And so when I wrote the epilogue, it was very much a tone of cautious optimism. And I had to work closely with the CIA because I'm former CIA. I signed this, lifetime secrecy agreement when I was 21 years old, which I feel like is like highly unfair. Like those of us who joined that young, we were like child brides to the organization. We're signing our life away. And so they do have to read the manuscript. And so I was very transparent with them and said, listen, this is not a hit piece. I meant to, I want to give the organization credit where credit's due, because I think that an enormous amount of progress has been made. I'm not going to shy away from some of the less favorable parts of the agency's history, but by and large, I was feeling cautiously optimistic when I had visited headquarters summer of 23 to interview some current women. But obviously that's changed because some of those groups that were instrumental to some of this progress were grassroots organizations. They were what we call employee resource groups, who drove changes like creating a daycare on the campus at Langley, mothers' rooms, all these different things to help with work-life balance, ensuring women and minorities are on promotion panels. And so I like to say that I think DEI can get a negative rap. Out in, the outside world from the agency, it's considered a dirty word at times, it's a buzzword, but for the CIA, diversity is absolutely instrumental to what we do. I mean, we are meeting with people from every part of the globe. We need to have linguistic diversity, cultural diversity of thought. If we want to develop rapport with people and convince them to commit treason against their own country, for the sake of our national security, we need to be able to understand the way they think and their viewpoint and connect with them and find out what's important to them. We cannot go back to a time, which we were, an organization that was male, pale, and Yale. That just does not serve anyone.
Well, the thing that drives me crazy is that just the idea that women would be hired is called diversity. You know, I mean,
Right.
We're half the population.
We're not saying let's lower the bar,
Yeah,
right?
really,
and
really.
that's I think that's such a great point, Terry,
Yeah.
because that point is lost.
Yeah.
Because no one is saying we want to lower the bar and let people in the CIA who aren't qualified. No, we just want, for a long period of time, the way promotions and field assignments were handed out was in a back room with, we call them Vespers, cocktails and glasses of brandy and, choosing your buddies to go. It was an old boys
We
club.
too can drink brandy.
Yeah, exactly. All right. And so there was no, organized, formalized structure. There was literally a book that was consulted with the favorite men and they were given the posh assignments, right?
Yeah.
So we are just asking for an equal playing field. We're not lowering the bar. You can't get in the door there if you don't meet, such a high bar. And I always say the hardest part about leaving the CIA is you are so used to being surrounded with such a high caliber of people,
Yep,
men and
yep,
women.
yep, yep.
And nowhere else will hold a candle to it because you're spoiled with being surrounded by the most intelligent, impressive, ambitious people. Right? I mean, so everyone that's there that is qualified. So there's no such thing as lowering it so that, women can finally get their piece of the pie.
Jeez. Terry, in your writing, you write about social issues.
Yes.
Can you just give us a couple examples of some of the issues in either one of you have a new book out, Deep Dive, or your other series?
The latest book that I wrote is about the issue of abortion politics in Texas, and about how hard it is, how hard it struck women, and how women are trying to deal with that. And of course, one of the women gets murdered in this book. It was oddly enough, I wasn't sure I could write this book because I thought it was such a fraught subject. And I talked to my agent, and she said, if anybody can write this book, you can.
That's
So
agent.
I had friends who said, you're going to make yourself a target by writing this book. And I did get a few reviews from readers who said, well, you made all the good guys pro-abortion. And that wasn't my intention at all. It was my intention to explore the whole issue and how it affected everyone. But I've also dealt with, in other books, one of my favorite books dealt with the way we treat veterans in this country. Another one was about people with mental issues. I try to, the one that I'm just doing the editing for now, which will come out in December, is one that I didn't even realize what it was until I was almost done. And I said, oh my God, this is about an oil and gas man who has a stranglehold on a lot of people in Texas. And it turns out to be, I think it turned out to be a really good book because there's some really terrible repercussions that can happen for whatever happens in the book. And that they're serious books. I mean, I really try to write serious subjects in these books. So yeah.
Now, both of you, in your careers, are subject to review by others,
Yes.
publicly or privately. I imagine yours is more private than they don't announce what they do at Langley in the New York Times. How would you say, is there any hint of discrimination in the reviews, like you were talking about in Texas or in the CIA? Do you sense there was or is it still going on?
You do hear horror stories of people putting their manuscripts through the CIA for review and them sort of trying to censor it and not wanting particular things out. So I was nervous going in, particularly the latter chapters, because I do talk about the CIA's current dilemma it faces in terms of sexual harassment and sexual assault, which unfortunately is a theme that I found throughout the decades. I didn't anticipate diving into it as much as I did, but because it has come to a head in recent years with some very brave women who went to Congress, which jump-started an investigation which found that the CIA did in fact mishandle these reports of sexual assault. And so I was particularly worried about those chapters, that they would try to cut things or, different things like that. But they didn't touch them. And so I think they knew that probably that wouldn't be a good look. So thankfully, it wasn't, it wasn't difficult to go through them. They were pretty supportive, surprisingly. So, but I've heard it can go either way, so you never know.
Yeah.
Interesting. I really enjoy both of your books, yours and yours. I found, as you know, I was in the Peace Corps, and I was told somebody is going to come through your town, and they're going to be asking you strange questions, and be aware they're CIA. But in your book, you mentioned how the CIA made it kind of clear they didn't want to do that. And the only question I got in 3 years was, what's the best restaurant in this town?
Good, I'm glad.
So it was not that.
Yeah.
Terry, can you tell us a little bit about Deep Dive, even though it's not available here today, unfortunately? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I write this series that is more serious, and at some point about a couple of years ago, I said, I'd like to write something fun. So I wrote one book that was set in the Bahamas, and it was fun, and then I discovered that people say, well, you were with the CIA, why don't you write about the CIA? Well, I discovered that the FBI had a dive program, and I wanted to write about a female diver because diving terrifies me. And I thought, well, write what terrifies you. And so I looked into the dive program with the FBI, and it turns out that countries all over the world ask the FBI to come and help them with examining shipwrecks and airplane wrecks and all kinds of things that happen in the water. And I thought, I want this woman to be part of the program. And it's really just adventure stories. That's what I wanted to write, is adventure stories. Fun, something, wonderful to do. And all I have to say about this book is there's a shark.
Now, I'm just imagining, but as an author,
Yes.
do you ever think about some of your books made in movies? And do you ever think about your book? Maybe, I don't know how you could recreate that in a movie, but I could see a way to do it. Why don't we start with you first, Christina?
Yes. Think about it all the time. I actually do have a couple of TV projects that I'm working on right now, so hopefully see how the next few weeks go, and I'll have some news to share, not related to this book, but it is something that always comes to mind, just kind of envisioning different mediums for your art to be in. So I would love to see this book made into a show, like a period piece, but I understand like Hollywood right now, they don't like doing things right now that are set in a different period. I don't know. Hollywood, it's always changing.
Always.
So you never know, but ideally I would love to see, if you've ever seen the show Good Girls Revolt. I don't know why it was canceled. It was fantastic. It was some weird algorithm thing with Amazon Prime Video, but it was women working at, I don't know if it was Newsweek or they were journalists, I think in the 70s. It's a fantastic show. So something like that, but like women at the CIA in the 90s, right? So we'll see. But there's always...
It would be hard. It seems like it would be hard to really do that without, it would be, although... Let's look at Slow Horses. That's, yeah.
I was going to ask you, when you look at Slow Horses, do you ever think about what they're doing, how they're run? Is there a CIA equivalent to the Slough House?
I don't know. Who knows? I hope not.
I mean, do CIA agents go someplace to recover before they go on to the next assignment?
They could.
We had something like that in the Peace Corps. That's why I asked.
With regard to the movies, of course I would love to have my books made into a series. And I get this question constantly. And if anyone out there would like to do it, go for it. I would be happy. I mean, the other day, somebody on the beach said to my husband, "Has she been optioned?" And he said, "No." And I said, "And did you say, but she's available?" It's a crapshoot. It's a hard
It is.
one.
I think there's like a percentage of even like the number of books that are optioned, like the percentage that actually make it into development
Yes.
are very small. But
Very
it's
small.
exciting
And
to think about.
I have a friend who's a screenwriter, and he had this great idea. He was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop the idea, and they said at the end, "We think it's too sophisticated." They let him keep the money. And I said,
Oh my gosh.
well, that's ridiculous.
I always wondered when you see people go up and like accept their Oscar speech and they say like, "This movie has been 10 years in the making." And I'm always like, really? But now I get it.
Yeah.
It's very slow.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Now, you also work for Amazon. Can you elaborate a little bit what you did with them and how your CIA experience helped you with that?
Yeah, so when I left the CIA, I entered information security at Amazon. And, interesting male, dynamic there as well, obviously being in tech. I always say it's like Bizarro world where there's always a line for the men's restroom, but there's never a line for the women's. But that's where I started, surrounded by, very intelligent people there. And it was a natural kind of transition. I was working on insider threat and threat analysis. And so that was a good fit. I ended up going over to corporate communications, looking at messaging, which was a great transfer of skills for my time as an analyst. And I always say that because of both the caliber of people at the CIA, but also the training is so exceptional that I really do think that when we leave, there's like nothing we can't do. But the one thing that keeps people is that some people do have a difficult time making the jump because you have to have your resume cleared. There's only so much that you can share about what you did. And so it really does hinge on your ability to explain how your skills are transferable and then prove that you can adapt to a different work culture. But I do think that we are so well trained to do and be successful at a variety of areas. And I think Terry is a great example of that as well.
I was in the computer field. So I get out, I go to get a job here in San Francisco, and I had this set of skills that was highly, highly desirable from the CIA. So I go in, I tell them what I want to do. I want this much money. I want to do. So the director takes me out to lunch, and he says, "Well, we'd like to pay you less, but in 6 months we'll give you a raise, and we'll give you a better position." I said, "No, I want you to give me the money now, and in 6 months you'll give me another raise." And he said, "Okay."
Well, you have to be willing to do that.
No, you have to know. The thing is that you know that your skills are there,
Yes.
and you have to be able to say these are my skills, and they're important.
And advocate for yourself. I think that's key.
Exactly. And here's the coda to that is his secretary came in one day, and she looked at me, and I said, this is when I first started working, and I said, "Can I help you?" And she said, "I just wanted to get a look at you. You're the first person that he has ever kowtowed to."
Oh, there you go.
Wow.
It was just funny. I mean, but I think you're right. It's you're in a high level. You know you're in a high level. You know what your skills are. You know how to do it, and you have to. You just let them know.
Yeah, and it's a world that people on the outside don't know much about other than what they've seen in the movies, and we know how accurate that is. And so it's on us to really explain, no, this is what I did, and here's how it applies to what, we do here.
Exactly.
And I remember when I wanted to make the switch at Amazon from information security to communications, I first did like an internal interview. And the only reason I got that was because I was already an Amazonian. And I remember I met with my future boss, who's now a dear friend of mine to this day. And she had said that she would have never interviewed me if I didn't already work there, because I didn't have the on paper experience that they were used to seeing, someone apply with. And so luckily I had this whole informal interview loop where I explained, this is who I briefed, at the White House, National Security Council. This is how it's similar to crafting messages in public relations, right? And so then once I proved all that, then I had to do a real interview loop with 5 people again. But you really, it is opaque, to people in different career fields, which, rightfully so, it is clandestine for a reason. And so being able to be savvy enough to explain that and advocate for yourself, I think are really crucial to make that jump to the private sector.
Did you ever at any time have doubts about what you were doing and second thoughts?
Ooh, coming at me with a surprise question, Frank.
It is.
I did. As an analyst, I did less so. Well, let me back that up. So I joined the CIA not because I was overly patriotic, not that I'm not, sure, but because of my love for a foreign land. I loved Africa, and I'm sure you can relate, having done the Peace Corps in Cote d'Ivoire. And there are so many people who had done the Peace Corps who I worked with at the agency, because if you've done the Peace Corps, you can join the CIA if it's been at least 5 years. If you do the CIA first, you can never join the Peace Corps, right?
That's right, yep.
And so those of us who work Africa there was a camaraderie. We all had a very strong love for the continent, for languages, our expertise. And so I did at times struggle when I was writing for the President's Daily Brief, because you're always looking for a U.S. angle. Why does this matter to us? Why is this important to America? And so for me, as like a young idealistic 21-year-old who wanted to, do humanitarian work in Africa, I'm like, well, it matters because they're people. And so that was hard. But then I think when I switched to the operational side, that was very different because I had to learn how to live in the gray. My husband, who was a case officer at the agency, he was born to live in the gray. I always tease him that if we knew each other growing up, we would have never dated, because I was a rule follower, a straight A student, and he was a little more loosey-goosey, which is how he ended up a case officer. And so he has taught me to live more in the gray. And what I mean by that is that the answer in training in the DO is always, it depends. And because it is a gray area when you're talking about people's vulnerabilities, their motivations, what makes them tick. And while it can be very interesting, I sometimes struggled with this idea of how genuine is the relationship that I'm building with this person if my goal is to recruit them so that they'll share secrets with me, right? So I had a hard time with that. My husband would sit here and tell you, no, it was a real genuine friendship. and I really do honestly believe that he and many other case officers do believe that, and built great friendships with their assets. Of course, then you have to turn them over. But we do have some that we keep in touch with. But that was hard for me at times. I do remember some days walking to my car in the behemoth parking lot at headquarters, thinking, what am I doing? Particularly when I was working on counterterrorism and we were tracking the mastermind behind the U.S. Embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in '98. It was just something I never had envisioned myself doing. And so I think I knew that at one point I was going to leave. I didn't know under what circumstances. I just envisioned myself walking over the seal and never looking back. Not that I didn't believe in what I was doing, but because it is challenging. It is a sacrifice for many reasons.
Well, there are people that you talk about in your book that
absolutely
made huge sacrifices.
Tremendous sacrifices. And those are some of the themes that I think throughout the book I hope will resonate with readers regardless of their career field, because there are a series of choices that we all make in our lives with regards to our careers, with regards to family, elder care, health, all of these things. And so I really wanted to humanize these women. I wanted you to feel like you were sitting across from them and sharing a cup of coffee and realizing that, yes, they're doing extraordinarily, dangerous and important work, but they're also real people who are making decisions, at times impossible decisions about their lives, that we've all made in some shape or form.
You wrote a lot about women having to decide really between raising a family, having a husband or a partner, and doing the work, and that oftentimes relationships didn't last. Do you think that would ever change in the future, or is that just consistent with the job?
I think it has changed in the sense that in the early days, women often were not sponsored to go to the farm because the idea was we don't want to put more money and resources because they could, just get pregnant and leave. They could get married and just leave at any time. And then we've put all that time and resource into them. And, how could they possibly do this job? And so in the 60s and 70s, you saw a lot of women who were lying about being fertile or not to get positions, and then getting pregnant on a field tour, and then out on the streets running their op 3 days postpartum, which is just, it was not unique. It was very common. But it was this idea that a woman could not run operations, particularly if she had a family. Never mind the fact that men also had families and were running operations. And so you see that theme throughout the book. I do talk about the bombing in Afghanistan and Khost in 2009, and some of the fallout from that because the chief of base was a woman. And some of the criticism afterwards was, well, she had no business being in a war zone. She was a mother. Never mind the fact that, there were men who died in that as well, who were fathers. One of them even had a call sign related to being a father. It's not in the book because the agency made me redact it. So it's an interesting conversation that was had around that. So I think it has changed. Obviously that's not keeping women from doing the training now, but you do still see that when you look, at the top, we had our first woman CIA director in 2018. In 2021, we had all of the agency directorates led by women for the first time, which was incredible. But if you do look at the women who have made it to the most senior levels, they are women who have made sacrifices and do not have families, or married, a man who already had kids. And so there are women who look up and say, oh, that doesn't really look appealing to me, right? And so I do think we have a long way to go in terms of true work-life balance to allow for women to be in those roles, because I do think that we bring different perspectives and it's vital, but it's a work in progress.
Terry, on the same light, you write a lot about important social issues. Would you consider? Well, let me preface that with saying, when I read a book like yours, it makes me think. I don't know if I change anything, but it makes me think. Would you consider yourself an agent of change in social thinking about social issues?
I hope so. I certainly hope so. That's, I don't want to be didactic when I write, because I don't like to read a book that is obviously didactic. I want to read something where the fabric of the community is important, and something happens that makes a ruffle through that, that can create problems in everyday life, and that makes people think about that. Well, what would I do in that situation? And is this person doing the right thing or the wrong thing? I have a protagonist that I always feel like takes the ethical side, and one of the reviews I got was, these books are for people who want their books with a strong ethical sense. And I really appreciated that. I felt like that was important to me. So the answer is, I hope that it is an agent of change, that it gives people something to think about.
I have one question for you about the presidential reports that you wrote.
Yeah.
They were read by the presidents, I take it. I guess I can't go there, let's be off topic. But do you think that currently the person who does your job feels that they have, that what they're doing is worth the effort?
Well.
It's just a theoretical question.
Okay, let me say, it changes with every administration, right? So when, a new president comes into the White House, we're always figuring out, what is this particular president's reading style? How can we change the book?
Can they read?
Yeah. How can we change the book to ensure that it's to this president's liking, right? And so I worked under President George W. Bush and President Obama, and they had very different approaches to the PDB. We call it the President's Daily Brief book. President Bush was a very engaged customer. Now you can think about that in terms of the CIA is named after his father, and so he was a very an avid customer of our work. He was a big believer in the CIA's analysis, particularly being an Africa analyst. I will tell you, people ask me who I preferred to write for, and it was Bush. And it was because he was more engaged on Africa, okay? And I've always said this with anecdotal evidence, but I will tell you that recently a former colleague of mine, I think he's at, I don't know if he's at CSIS now, his name is Judd Devermont, and he wrote an analysis of all US presidents and their policy towards Africa. And he actually came up with using actual data in terms of meetings with African leaders to analyze this. And The Economist actually just came out with a piece just in the past couple days using his analysis. And so I was so pleased to read it because I finally had data to back up the fact that he has done more for Africa than any U.S. president. So if you don't believe me, go read Judd Devermont's piece and this article in The Economist. And so for me, he particularly enjoyed Tanzania. And so for me, it was a great customer to write for. President Obama used more drop books at that time. So we would have, so when you write for the President's Daily Brief book, one of the most exciting things is you're coming in the morning at 4:35 a.m., you go up to the 7th floor, and you brief the briefers, right? And so you get to talk to the person that's going to go take the book to the president, and whomever the president has decided gets to read the book. And so you get to say, hi, I'm the author of the Kenya piece. Do you have any questions, right? And then that person goes and briefs. And so depending on the president, they may have that briefing or not. And so Obama a lot of times didn't like to read it. You know, everyone has different styles. So that's my own personal experience. As for the current administration, I haven't worked under this particular president in either term, but I can tell you, having written, so one of the products that I wrote the most of as an analyst was what's called a leadership profile. And that is a psychological profile of a foreign leader, and it is the most requested intelligence product of our U.S. government officials, because we are prepping them for their meetings with foreign leaders, right? So it's everything from things to talk to them about, what makes this leader tick, what's their style, who do they surround themselves with, right? All of those things down to, like, you know, their likes and dislikes. So I will tell you that in the past, was it yesterday or was it, okay, that the Liberia leadership analyst is probably just shaking their head right now because that obviously was not read before the meeting. So if you have followed that news story, you know what I'm talking about. If not, go watch that clip because it's one
painful.
for, yeah, it's, yeah.
Well, with that, we're going to have time for some questions and answers. Trinity, if you is back there, she's getting the microphone. And if you can raise your hand, be patient. She will get around to many of you. Okay, first question.
Valerie Plame.
That's it? That's the question? Valerie has become a dear friend of mine through the process of writing this book. I was so grateful that she lended her voice to this and wrote the foreword. And she joined me for one of the book launch events in DC recently. And I think that, yeah, her story in particular, I mean, it begs the question of, would it have been different had she been a man? I mean, we can pontificate over that all day long. I can tell you what my thoughts are. But she also wrote a really great piece a year or two ago in Foreign Policy about her experience as well, similar to some things that she shared in the foreword as a woman joining in the 80s. So I think, yeah, I mean, her situation obviously was just, I mean, unfathomable to have your cover blown like that and to have your career basically you know, ended over that. It's
blown
yeah, I mean,
word,
it's just so preposterous, especially when you're looking at things like the current dilemma in terms of reporting sexual assault. One of the things women are often told at the agency is they're discouraged from reporting their assault to law enforcement because they're told if they share their accuser's name, that's a federal crime because they've blown that CIA officer's cover. And so it's kind of humorous when you think of it in that regard. But yeah, Valerie's fantastic. She lended her voice to the foreword, and she actually also narrates the foreword in the audiobook. And I'm really grateful for her support.
Yeah.
See, here she is over here.
Is it difficult to leave the
CIA?
Yes and no. It is difficult in terms of. Okay, I did this. My favorite podcast interview I've ever done was on a podcast called "Sounds Like a Cult," and it's with this woman named Amanda Montell, and she writes this wonderful book called "Cultish: The Language of Modern Day Cults." I might have messed up the subtitle there, but it's amazing. The paperback recently came out. It's on the bestseller list, New York Times bestseller list, for like the 5th week. Well deserved. So I went on her podcast and I talk about, because as I read her book and was listening to her podcast, I reached out to her and I said, "Oh my goodness, Amanda, the CIA is a cult." Like, and I started listing things off, right? And so it's hard to leave in the sense that it is such an insular culture, and you're told over and over again, like, you're the cream of the crop, you're the best of the best, stay in here where we'll take care of you, this is the best place to be, you don't want to be out there in the private sector, it's so risky, you could lose your job at any time, but look where we are now. I know plenty of people at the CIA who have been walked out recently since January. So, but they create sort of this idea that you can't leave. But logistically, you can leave. And when you give the notice to resign, like I am telling you, like you find out very soon that like you are replaceable. And so you can leave, but it is this mindset that you can't. And once you make that jump and you're like on the outside and you realize like there's this whole creative world out there where like you can jump, on a plane to another country with a moment's notice without asking anyone for permission. Really? You can sleep with as many foreign nationals as you want. There's no privacy there, and so I say that in jest. But really, there are certain foreign nationals that you're not allowed to be friends with. If you do have an intimate relationship with a non-American, you have to report that to your boss, right? So there are all these restrictive measures, right? So once you get out and you're living a very different life, your colleagues who are still in, they sort of like can see you over there, and you become this rare unicorn, and you start getting messages on LinkedIn, and they're kind of like, "Hey, how did you do this?"
I'll tell you that when I left, I still remember this because they had told, they tell you all this stuff that you have to be careful about, okay, that you have to really know, that you be aware, that you don't talk about these things, you don't deal with. In my exit interview, they reminded me of all these things, and I said, I would have forgotten all this. I wouldn't remember any of this. But it's a funny thing when you leave.
Yeah.
They remind you that you are part of this whole,
Yeah.
So there have been some, I don't know if this is working, there have been some really interesting, well-publicized, both known and suspected cases in recent years of foreign governments using agents, female agents, and developing relationships with our public figures. Can you talk a little bit about whether other countries are maybe further along the curve to using female agents, and how particularly maybe DE&I, anti-DE&I sentiment may impact our understanding or readiness for that?
You mean potentially putting us at a disadvantage, like we're the modern day KGB, not thinking women are, okay, I can see that. I thought you were going somewhere else with that, because there are plenty of foreign intelligence services who use women as honeypots. And so I'll take this as an opportunity to say we do not. And I share that because my husband and I often give advice to a lot of young people who are considering careers in intelligence, and we think it's a very admirable career, and we're always encouraging and supportive in as much as we can be. And I was recently having a conversation with a very bright young woman, and she had just graduated high school, getting ready to go to college, and got into all of her top universities. And again, very bright, would be fantastic in the DO. And she says to me, Christina, there's something I don't think I can do. And I said, okay. She said, I didn't want to tell Ryan about it. I felt a little awkward. I said, okay. She said, I just don't think I can have sex with strangers. And I said, well, why would you do that? And she says, well, I know that's what the CIA is going to ask me to do. And I said, hold on. How long have you been thinking that that's what I did for a living? So I let her know that that's not what we do. And I just think I share that because, one, it's just hysterical. And again, she is very bright and love her to death. And, but that is exactly why we need this book. Because even in the year 2025, we have young women and probably grown adults thinking that that is what women at the CIA are doing to collect intelligence, and we do not. Certainly there are other foreign intelligence services who use blackmail. I mean, on that note, when Snowden and all of that came about, my husband actually worked with Ed in a field station, and when it all came out, my husband sees him on the news, he's like, what? It's Ed. and one of the things that my husband was just appalled by is that one of the stories he had talked about was in a particular country about how our station was devising an op to work with that particular country on blackmailing a target into working with us. And my husband just like put his head in his hands, because that is something, well, one, in that particular country, we didn't have a good relationship with the host government, so it would never happen for that alone. But two, blackmailing is not something that we do. I know you see it in the movies, but I will tell you that there are so many stories of the CIA, like the way that we take care of our assets. I mean, it is with the utmost integrity. The reason we do surveillance detection routes is because we know that these people are meeting with us at great risk to themselves and their families, and we take it very seriously. We go to extreme lengths if one of our assets passes, and maybe we've been holding their money in an account because it would raise flags to their home country, if they all of a sudden had lots of money, right? We will track down their next of kin to ensure that they are paid. So, yes, while DEI initiatives are being rolled back here and we're maybe behind in some of those aspects, I will say that in terms of the way that we run operations and the integrity that our intelligence services have here in the U.S. is, by far leaps and bounds, I think, ahead of many other countries. Would you agree, Terry?
I don't know anything about the current CIA, about how it's run. I just know that.
Well, it's changed over the years, so
I'm
there are less,
sure it is.
favorable
I'm sure
moments.
It has.
Sure.
I happened to be there during the time of the Gary Powers incident, so it was there was a lot of embarrassment that went on. So yeah, that's all.
Just out of curiosity, is his plane still somewhere?
I don't know.
Oh, I'm just curious.
God knows.
We have time for at least one more question.
Hi, I really love the wording on a lot of this. It feels like being in Bizarro World when Andrew Tate and Palantir are in the news as often as each other sometimes, which is the context for my question for both of you, please, because I'm wondering, in your professional experiences and training, what do you think will remain de facto, let's say, classics or traits or qualities, considerations to keep in mind? Whereas what would be, let's say, on your mind or something to keep an eye out for as a woman, personally and professionally? Because without delving into, change social dynamics and whatnot, but again, really feels like Bizarro World in terms of gender dynamics, personally and professionally. So I'm just super curious from your careers and experiences, what you feel comfortable sharing with what you would keep in mind. Again, that remains part of your part and parcel classical training, and traits to keep in mind for the changes in the world you find yourself in now as a woman.
I think, discernment, of course, is very important. I think, you see kind of waves of change. It's interesting because when I did those interviews at headquarters in the summer of 23, and everyone was kind of feeling cautiously optimistic. It's funny because now, only in hindsight, with what I know now, it's almost eerie, because one of the things, and actually I think it is in the book, in the epilogue, where one of the women mentions the DEI initiatives, and then she mentions that there was such a big push that they were starting to see some DEI fatigue. And it's just so interesting to read that back, knowing what I know now. But anyway, I digress. But I do think that a lot of this kind of the pendulum will swing. And so it's my hope that with kind of these traits of discernment and adaptability, that we can just weather that and the pendulum will swing back. But we just need to kind of hold tight for a couple more years. But that's a tough one. I don't know that I have a great answer for you.
I think that women have to be forthright.
Yeah.
I think that women have to really speak their minds. And there are ways of doing that, but sometimes you have to step on some toes. Yeah, that's.
It's interesting because, you know, a lot of the change that we've seen in recent years at the agency has been from, you know, some of this Gen Z coming in that has this different energy, and they don't share this view that I and so many other women shared for so many decades, which is when you speak up or report an incident, it's career suicide, right?
Yeah.
But it was this new generation coming in that had this energy and this, you know, really just saying like, this is unacceptable, right?
Right.
And so that was really interesting to see that forthrightness coming about. But unfortunately, what I've heard anecdotally in the last few months is that the environment now at Langley is akin to a funeral, that it's very just somber, and there's a lot of fear right now.
Well, that's interesting because I see, you know, in the Justice Department and the FBI, you read a lot of things that are going on. I don't hear about the CIA as much, and it seems like it's more under the radar. So
Well, and what's hard to see from you know, being on the outside now
yeah,
is that this idea of the CIA being full of loyalists and being political, it's just so insulting to
Yeah.
so many of us because I did not know the politics of any of my colleagues. It was never discussed.
Yeah.
We served whatever president who was elected. Like, it was not like our job was to be as objective as possible. I was laying out what was happening in my African country, right? And giving options. If the U.S. were to do this, this is what would happen. This is an opportunity for U.S. engagement, you know, XYZ, right? We are not making policy at the CIA. And, you know, there are certain activities we're prohibited from even doing in our free time that are, you know, related to political activism. And so I never knew, you know, I could tell you more about what my colleagues thought of, you know, different African politics in different countries than what they thought here. And so this idea that, you know, it is politicized. I'm not saying it hasn't ever been politicized. Of course, there are incidents, right? But we go through so much training to ensure that we're not politicizing our analysis. And to me, it just demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of the purpose of an intelligence organization.
yeah, oof, oof. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. Our thanks to Christina and Terry. I want to thank the audience for attending tonight's program. Shortly, the books will be available outside. I want to thank you for your patience, and I want to thank both of you for making my evening
Thank you.
so wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Frank.
Thank you.